Hello, dear students. Welcome to the Odyssey of Virtual Learning. Let us begin our journey by reading a very interesting topic, namely leasing. Now, what is a lease? A lease is a financial contract between the business customer, known as user or lessee, and the equipment supplier, normally known as owner or lessor, for using a particular asset or equipment over a period of time against the periodic payment called lease rentals. So that means there is a person who needs equipment, he doesn't have it and he want to use it. He want to use it against paying the rent. So, and there's a person who has an equipment and he want the other person to use it against the rent. So here we can say that the person who has the equipment is the owner or the lessor. The person who needs the equipment and he wants to use it by paying rent is the user or lessee. And for using the asset and for letting the lessee use the asset, there has to be a contract between the lessor and the lessee, which is a financial contract. And lessee can use the assets of the lessor by paying rent, or which is called lease rentals. Now let us explore the steps in leasing. What the lessee will do? Okay, first, lessee has to select the asset and the supplier, and then he will fix the design, specification, price, warranty, terms of delivery, servicing, etc. of the asset. After that, he will enter into a contract that is called the lease agreement with the lessor. And the lease agreement contains all the terms and conditions like period of the contract, timing, the rent amount, many other things, right? And after the lease agreement is signed, the lessee will get the asset from the lessor. Okay, so there are some elements of the leasing. Parties, that means there are two parties, namely the lessor, who's the owner, lessee, who's the user of the asset. Lessor, he is the owner of the asset that are being leased. He may be an individual or a joint stock company or a corporation or a financial institution. And lessee is the receiver of the service of the asset under a lease contract. Sometimes there is a lease broker who's an agent between the lessor and the lessee. He acts as an intermediary in arranging the lease deals. And finally, there is lease asset. The lease assets may be plant or machinery or equipment, land, building, anything, right? Types of lease agreements: operating lease, financial lease, sale and lease back, leverage lease, and then is domestic lease and international lease. In this video, I would be covering only operating lease and financial lease. Rest will be covered in my next video. So let us explore what is an operating lease. In case of operating lease, the lessor not only leases the asset of which he remains the owner throughout, but also undertakes to provide services attached to such asset. That means once the lease contract is signed between the lessor and the lessee, in case of an operating lease, lessor remains the owner throughout the lease period. This is the first important point. And second, he remains the owner of the leased asset throughout the period of the lease, he undertakes to provide the services attached to the assets like maintenance, repairs, technical advices, etc. So for such reason, this lease is also known as service lease. Normally computers or office equipments, trucks, etc. are coming and leased under the operating lease. The lease contract is generally for a period which is considerably shorter than the economic life of the asset. That means if the life of a machine is 10 years, then the lessor will give it on lease for a period which is less than 10 years. It may be 5 years, 4 years, 6 years, but it cannot be 10 years. It has to be less than 10 years. Since he leases it for a period which is less than the economic life of the asset, so what happens next? He does not therefore recover the full cost of the asset from one lessee only. So after the lease period is over, he gets back his asset and again he gives that asset on lease to another lessee. So the lease asset is returned to the lessor at the end of the lease period and is thereafter leased again to another lessee for another lease period. After its useful life is over, it is sold off and its scrap value is realized by the lessor. Operating lease generally contains a cancellation clause, wherein the lessee retains the right to cancel the lease agreement before the lease period is over. That means before the lease period gets over, the lessee has a right or he can cancel the agreement at any point of time. The lease agreement contains a maintenance clause whereby the lessor is required to maintain the leased assets. Everything about the asset has to be maintained by the lessor only. And the lease rentals therefore includes a part of the amortization of the cost of the equipment, cost of maintenance services provided by the lessor, and the profit of the lessor. Then comes the financial lease. In case of the financial lease, the lessor remains the owner of the lease assets during the lease period, right? So throughout the lease period, he remains the owner of the asset. No problem in that. But unlike the operating lease, he does not undertake its necessary maintenance. That means here, the owner is the lessor, the user is the lessee, and the maintenance has to be borne by the lessee only. The rental received by the lessor fully amortizes the cost of the equipment and earns a profit for him. So these leases are non-cancelable in nature. Ultimately, the ownership of the leased asset may be transferred to the lessee at an agreed price. Thus, the lessor does act as a financier only and earns a return on his investment in the leased asset by way of rentals. The financial lease are for the major part of the useful life of the asset. So that is why it is called capital lease, long-term lease, net lease or closed lease. And this lease agreement is irrevocable or non-cancelable in nature. Okay, the lessee enters into an irrevocable, non-cancelable combat with the lessor, where the lessee uses the equipment, maintains it, insures it, bears the risk of obsolescence, etc. Okay, the length of this basic terms depend on the economic life of the asset and is usually shorter than the expected life of the asset. There is a purchase option where the lessee purchases the equipment after the lease period is over. Okay. Now let us discuss the differences between the operating lease and the financial lease. Definition we have already covered. We would be starting from the point duration on the basis of duration. Operating lease is a short-term lease whereas financial lease is a long-term lease. Cost. In case of the operating lease, the lessor pays the cost of the maintenance, whereas in case of the financial lease, the lessee pays the maintenance cost. Cancellation and changeable. Operating lease is cancelable in nature and it is changeable contract. Whereas in case of the financial lease, it is non-cancelable lease and it is not a changeable lease contract. Risk. In operating lease, it is the lessor who bears the risk of the asset. Whereas in case of the financial lease, the lessee bears the risk of the asset. Purchase. In case of the operating lease, at the end of the lease period, asset is not purchasable. Whereas in case of the financial lease, at the end of the contract, the asset is purchasable. Renew. In case of operating lease, it is renewable in nature, whereas in case of the financial lease, it is not renewable in nature. Operating lease is also otherwise known as service lease, short-term lease, cancelable lease, whereas financial lease is known as a capital lease, long-term lease, non-cancelable lease. Dear students, I would like to conclude here only. Remaining types of the lease contracts will be covered in my next video. Thank you.